At the party, my wife announced we were in an open relationship. I simply said, "As you wish," then asked her gorgeous friend out in front of everyone. What her friend said next made the whole room gasp. I never imagined that a casual Friday evening at the Worthington estate would become the moment everything changed, but sometimes life has its own timeline that doesn't consult your plans. The irony wasn't lost on me that this particular gathering was supposed to celebrate new beginnings, as Marcus and Diana had just returned from their anniversary trip to Tuscany with stories of discovering rare vintages in family-owned vineyards. I was actually enjoying myself at Marcus and Diana's wine tasting event, discussing the complex notes of a 2015 Bordeaux with Elena, a local sommelier who had fascinating insights about how terroir affects flavor profiles. The evening had started perfectly. I'd arrived early to help Marcus set up the tasting stations, arranged the crystal glasses in proper order, and even suggested the pairing of aged cheeses that had everyone raving about the thoughtful combinations. The gathering was intimate but sophisticated, maybe 30 people from our social circle, all successful professionals who appreciated good wine and intelligent conversation rather than the superficial networking events Stephanie usually preferred. The Worthington estate provided the perfect backdrop with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens, antique furniture that spoke of generations of refined taste, and that subtle lighting that made everyone look their best while maintaining an atmosphere of elegant sophistication. I should have recognized that particular gleam in Stephanie's eyes as she moved through the room like a predator stalking prey, the same calculating look she got before making what she called her bold moves, in social situations that usually left someone feeling uncomfortable or diminished. She had been unusually animated all evening, laughing too loudly at mediocre jokes, touching people's arms when she spoke, and positioning herself at the center of every conversation circle like she was performing rather than participating. The warning signs were all there, but I was too focused on actually enjoying meaningful conversations about art, travel, and the fascinating process of wine aging to notice her building towards something dramatic. She cleared her throat and tapped her champagne flute with a silver spoon, the crystal chime cutting through the murmur of conversations about vintage collections, upcoming gallery openings, and summer vacation plans to European wine regions. "Everyone, I have an exciting announcement to share," she said, her voice carrying that forced brightness she used when she wanted to control a room and become the absolute center of attention. The conversations died instantly, 30 pairs of eyes turning toward my wife as she stood there in her designer cocktail dress, looking like she owned the moment and everyone in it. I watched from across the room, still holding my wine glass, as she savored the power of having commanded complete silence from a room full of accomplished people. "Victor and I have decided to embrace a more modern approach to marriage," she continued, her smile growing wider as she fed off the attention like it was oxygen she needed to survive. "We're opening our relationship and exploring connections with other people. It's really quite liberating once you move past conventional thinking." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the corner, the soft hum of the wine refrigerator, and what sounded like someone's sharp intake of breath from the direction of the kitchen doorway. I felt every gaze shift from Stephanie to me, waiting for my reaction, probably expecting anger, embarrassment, desperate pleading, or maybe even a dramatic confrontation that would give them something to discuss at dinner parties for months. The weight of their collective attention should have been crushing, but instead I felt oddly calm, like I was watching this scene unfold from outside my own body. Instead, I calmly set down my wine glass on the mahogany side table, took a measured breath, and looked directly at Isabella, Stephanie's colleague from the art gallery who had been standing near the French doors leading to the garden, observing the entire scene with those intelligent dark eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Isabella was everything Stephanie pretended to be, genuinely sophisticated without being pretentious, naturally elegant without requiring constant validation, and brilliant in her field without needing to announce her credentials to every person she met. She had been quietly engaging in thoughtful conversations all evening, asking insightful questions about the wine selection, sharing fascinating stories about art authentication, and somehow making everyone she spoke with feel more interesting and valued. "Isabella," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room with steady confidence that surprised even me, Would you like to accompany me to the Children's Hospital Charity Gala next Saturday? I believe it's going to be a lovely evening, and I think you'd genuinely enjoy the silent auction. They're featuring some remarkable contemporary pieces from local artists. The room remained completely frozen as Isabella's lips curved into what I can only describe as a devastating smile that somehow managed to be both gracious and absolutely lethal. She looked directly at Stephanie with those perceptive eyes, then back to me, and said in her cultured voice that somehow managed to be both warm and cutting, "I'd be delighted, Victor. And unlike some people here, I actually know how to appreciate a good man when I see one." The elegant gathering erupted into shocked whispers and barely contained gasps as Isabella's words hit the room like a perfectly thrown dart finding its target. I watched Stephanie's confident facade crumble in real time, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally raw panic as she realized her carefully orchestrated power play had just spectacularly backfired in the most public way possible. The woman who moments earlier had been commanding the room's attention with her bold announcement now looked like someone who had just watched her house of cards collapse in a strong wind. Her mouth opened and closed wordlessly as she tried to process that her own colleague, someone she considered a friend and ally, had just publicly declared herself a better option while accepting a date invitation that Stephanie had inadvertently created the opening for. Marcus and Diana exchanged one of those meaningful glances that married couples perfect after years together, the kind of silent communication that said they'd be discussing this evening in detail once their guests left and they could properly dissect what had just transpired in their elegant living room. I noticed several other guests were clearly struggling not to smile at the unexpected turn of events, particularly Rebecca from the museum board, who had always seemed uncomfortable with Stephanie's tendency to dominate conversations and make everything about herself. The social dynamics in the room had shifted completely, and everyone could feel it. Stephanie was no longer the puppet master controlling the evening's drama, but instead had become the victim of her own manipulation. Isabella collected her elegant black clutch from the side table where she'd placed it earlier, her movements graceful and deliberate as she prepared to make what I suspected would be a perfectly timed exit that would leave maximum impact. She approached me with that same composed confidence she'd displayed all evening, extending her hand in a gesture that was both professional and somehow intimate. "I'll text you the details about Saturday," she said, her voice warm but loud enough for everyone to hear, "and thank you for thinking of me. It's refreshing to meet someone who actually follows through on their invitations." The pointed reference to follow through felt like another calculated strike at Stephanie, who was notorious for making grand plans and social commitments that somehow never materialized into actual action. Isabella then turned to Marcus and Diana with perfect social grace, thanking them for such a memorable evening and fascinating wine selection, before making her way toward the front door with the kind of dignity that made everyone else in the room suddenly feel like they were witnessing something significant. Stephanie finally found her voice, though it came out higher and more strained than her usual controlled tone. "Wait, Isabella, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding here," she called out desperately, taking several quick steps toward her colleague like she could somehow physically stop the situation from spiraling further out of her control. "I was just making conversation, being provocative to spark interesting discussion among friends. It wasn't serious." The explanation sounded pathetic even to my ears, and I could see from the faces around the room that nobody was buying her sudden attempt to reframe her dramatic announcement as casual party banter. Isabella paused at the doorway, turned back with that devastating smile still in place, and delivered what I knew would be the line people remembered most from this evening. "Oh, I understood perfectly, Stephanie. You announced that Victor was available, and I'm simply accepting that generous offer. After all, you can't be upset about other people showing interest when you've just publicly declared he's on the market." The room fell into that particular kind of silence that follows a perfectly executed verbal knockout punch, and I found myself genuinely impressed by Isabella's ability to turn Stephanie's own words into a trap she couldn't escape from without looking even more foolish than she already did. Outside in the manicured garden of the estate, away from the shocked whispers and uncomfortable stares of our mutual friends, Stephanie frantically tried to convince me that her announcement was just a provocative joke meant to spark interesting conversation among sophisticated people who could appreciate bold social commentary. The moonlight filtering through the ornamental trees cast shadows across her face as she paced back and forth on the stone pathway, her designer heels clicking urgently against the weathered flagstones that had probably witnessed decades of dramatic conversations in this very spot. I stood quietly by the marble fountain, listening to the gentle trickling of water and watching her gesticulate wildly as she attempted to reconstruct her narrative in a way that would somehow make her the victim of a misunderstanding rather than the architect of her own humiliation. "You know, I would never actually want an open relationship," she insisted, her voice taking on that pleading quality she used when she realized her usual manipulation tactics weren't working. "I was just testing the waters, seeing how people would react to a controversial topic. You know how these wine tasting events can get boring with the same old conversations about vintage years and tasting notes." I methodically dismantled her excuses with the patience of someone who had finally seen behind the curtain and was no longer impressed by the performance. "Stephanie, you've been dropping hints for months about Derek from your gallery," I said, watching her face change as she realized I'd been paying attention to things she thought I'd missed. "Those suspicious late-night inventory sessions that somehow required just the two of you, the weekend client meetings that always seemed to involve expensive restaurants and never resulted in any actual sales you could discuss." Her defensive protests grew increasingly desperate as she tried to rewrite recent history, claiming that Derek was just a colleague who needed mentoring and that I was reading too much into innocent professional interactions. "You're being paranoid," she said, but her voice lacked conviction and her eyes kept darting away from mine like she was searching for an escape route from this conversation. I calmly explained that open relationships work both ways, and she didn't get to unilaterally set rules that only benefit her agenda while expecting me to remain faithful and available whenever she decided she needed emotional or financial support. "If you want to explore connections with other people, that's your choice," I continued, my voice steady and measured, "but you don't get to be shocked when I exercise the same freedom you just announced to 30 people. When she realized I was completely serious about the charity gala with Isabella, Stephanie's composed exterior completely shattered like expensive crystal hitting a marble floor. The mask of sophisticated control she'd worn all evening disappeared, replaced by raw panic and desperate fury that she could no longer contain or disguise. "You can't seriously be planning to go through with this ridiculous charade," she said, her voice rising to a pitch that probably carried back to the house. "Isabella was just being dramatic for effect, trying to embarrass me in front of our friends. She doesn't actually want to date you." The argument escalated when she threatened to call Isabella immediately and demand she cancel, claiming that as her colleague and friend, Isabella owed her loyalty and should respect the boundaries of our marriage. I reminded her that Isabella was an independent, accomplished woman who made her own decisions about who she wanted to spend time with, unlike the controlling dynamic Stephanie had tried to establish in our relationship where she expected to dictate terms while facing no consequences for her own choices. "Isabella can make her own decisions about Saturday," I said firmly, "and frankly, after watching how you've treated me tonight, I think she's demonstrated better judgment in 5 minutes than you have in 5 years. That comment hit harder than I intended, but I realized it was also more honest than anything I'd said to Stephanie in a very long time. The truth was that Isabella's immediate recognition of my worth, her instinctive defense of my dignity, and her graceful handling of an impossible social situation had shown me what it felt like to be valued rather than tolerated. Over the following days, Stephanie alternated between tearful apologies and furious accusations, revealing the depth of her manipulative nature as she cycled through every emotional manipulation tactic in her considerable arsenal, trying desperately to regain control of a situation that had completely escaped her ability to manage or spin. I watched this performance with the detached fascination of someone studying a particularly interesting psychological case study, finally seeing patterns I'd been too close to recognize when I was still emotionally invested in maintaining peace at any cost. Monday morning brought sobbing phone calls about how she'd made a terrible mistake and just needed me to understand that she was going through a confusing period in her life where she didn't know what she wanted. Tuesday featured angry voicemails accusing me of being vindictive and cruel, claiming I was trying to humiliate her publicly by following through on something she'd said in a moment of poor judgment influenced by too much champagne and social pressure. Wednesday brought elaborate explanations about how sophisticated couples in major cities often discussed open relationships as intellectual exercises, and I was being provincial and narrow-minded by taking her comments literally instead of understanding the nuanced social commentary she was attempting. I discovered the real truth through Marcus, who called me Thursday afternoon with information that finally made the entire evening click into perfect, pathetic focus. "I thought you should know," he said, his voice carrying that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver news that's both illuminating and disappointing. Derek apparently turned Stephanie down weeks ago when she made a pass at him at that gallery opening downtown. Rebecca heard it from Jennifer, who works with Derek's girlfriend at the marketing firm. He told Stephanie he wasn't interested in married women and suggested she work on her relationship with you instead of looking for external validation. The timing of Stephanie's public announcement suddenly made perfect sense. She hadn't been planning to pursue Derek as part of some grand open relationship philosophy, but rather was trying to save face after being rejected by creating a narrative where she was the one choosing to explore options rather than being turned down by someone she'd pursued. The sophisticated lifestyle experimentation was just elaborate cover for wounded pride and desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control over a situation where she'd been clearly dismissed by her target. During one particularly heated argument Thursday night, Stephanie accidentally revealed the full scope of her manipulative planning when she demanded I cancel the charity gala because I was supposed to fight for our marriage rather than actually taking advantage of the arrangement she'd publicly created. "This isn't how this was supposed to work," she screamed, finally showing me the real anger and frustration she'd been hiding behind her sophisticated explanations and emotional appeals. "You were supposed to be upset, to beg me not to do this, to prove that you couldn't live without me by refusing to let other people have access to our relationship." The admission was stunning in its naked honesty. She had never intended to actually open our relationship, but had planned to use the threat of it as emotional leverage to make me more compliant, more grateful, more willing to tolerate her increasingly entitled behavior without questioning her motives or demanding equal treatment. Her mask completely slipped when she continued, "Men are supposed to be territorial about their wives. You're supposed to be fighting other men away from me, not inviting them closer or worse, going after other women yourself." I realized that 7 years of subtle put-downs, public corrections, and emotional manipulation had all been building toward this moment of ultimate control, where she would threaten to leave or share herself with others, and I would supposedly panic and become more devoted, more subservient, more willing to accept whatever terms she dictated. The fact that I'd instead calmly accepted her announcement and immediately demonstrated that the same freedom applied to me had completely shattered her understanding of how our relationship dynamic was supposed to work. She'd expected tears, pleading, desperate promises to be better, more attentive, more whatever she claimed I was lacking, not calm acceptance and immediate action that treated her announcement as a genuine offer of freedom rather than a manipulation tactic designed to increase her power over me. After Stephanie attempted to manipulate our mutual friends by calling them with carefully crafted versions of events that painted me as vindictive and emotionally abusive, even going so far as to contact my family members with tearful stories about how I was destroying our marriage over a misunderstanding, I made the decisive choice to consult a divorce attorney and protect myself from what was clearly escalating into a campaign of character assassination. The phone calls to my parents were particularly calculating. She knew exactly which emotional buttons to push, describing herself as a confused woman who'd made a social mistake and was now being punished by a husband who refused to forgive or work on their relationship. She painted my decision to attend the charity gala with Isabella as evidence of my unwillingness to fight for our marriage, conveniently omitting the context that she'd publicly announced our open relationship status to 30 people without any prior discussion or consent from me. My mother called me Sunday morning, clearly upset and confused by Stephanie's version of events, asking why I was being so harsh with someone who was obviously struggling and just needed compassion and understanding to work through whatever issues had led to her poor judgment at the wine tasting. I spent an hour explaining the full context of what had actually happened, including Stephanie's months of suspicious behavior with Derek and her admission that the entire announcement had been designed as emotional manipulation rather than genuine relationship exploration. The revelation that Stephanie had been actively pursuing another man while simultaneously trying to make me feel guilty for accepting her public declaration of openness finally helped my family understand why I was no longer willing to participate in what had become a fundamentally dishonest relationship built on manipulation and control rather than mutual respect and genuine partnership. The revelation that I'd already filed preliminary paperwork with Patricia Blackwood, one of the city's most respected family law attorneys, sent Stephanie into complete panic mode as she realized her power play had cost her everything she actually wanted to keep: the financial security, social status, and comfortable lifestyle that came with being married to someone who'd been willing to tolerate her increasingly entitled behavior in exchange for what I'd mistakenly believed was love and partnership. Patricia had listened to my story with the kind of professional detachment that comes from years of seeing similar patterns, taking detailed notes about Stephanie's public announcement, her attempts to manipulate our social circle, and her admission that the entire scenario had been designed as emotional leverage rather than genuine relationship renegotiation. What you're describing is classic emotional manipulation with elements of public humiliation designed to increase her control over the relationship dynamic, Patricia explained during our first meeting. The fact that she's now attempting to reframe your reasonable response as vindictive behavior suggests she's operating from a playbook of manipulation tactics rather than genuine remorse or desire to repair the damage she's caused. She tried one final desperate manipulation by showing up at my office Tuesday afternoon with red-rimmed eyes and promises of couples therapy, marriage counseling, and whatever professional help I thought we needed to work through what she now characterized as a temporary breakdown in judgment brought on by work stress and social pressure from her more progressive colleagues at the gallery. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, standing in my office doorway like a supplicant seeking forgiveness, her voice taking on that vulnerable quality she'd perfected for maximum emotional impact. "Therapy, counseling, meditation retreats, whatever you think will help us get back to where we were before Friday night." But I had already emotionally detached from the toxic dynamic that had defined our relationship for years, finally seeing clearly how many times I'd been manipulated into accepting unacceptable behavior by similar performances of vulnerability and promises of change that never materialized into actual behavioral modifications. The woman standing in my office wasn't offering genuine change or accountability. She was simply trying a different manipulation tactic now that her usual methods had failed to produce the desired result of increased control and decreased independence on my part. Their friends began reaching out privately to express relief rather than surprise, revealing that they'd witnessed years of Stephanie's condescending treatment, public corrections, and subtle undermining of my confidence, but hadn't known how to address the obvious problems without creating social drama or choosing sides in what appeared to be relationship dynamics that I was willingly accepting. Marcus confided that he and Diana had discussed multiple times how uncomfortable they felt watching Stephanie belittle my opinions during dinner parties, interrupt my stories to offer her own versions, and generally treat me like an accessory to her social performance rather than an equal partner in our marriage. The divorce proceedings moved swiftly due to our prenuptial agreement and lack of children, with Stephanie's attempts at vindictive litigation backfiring spectacularly when her own behavior became the primary focus of depositions and her lawyer quietly advised her to accept the settlement terms rather than risk having her manipulative tactics exposed in open court proceedings. Patricia had warned me that vindictive spouses often try to drag out divorce proceedings as a final form of control and punishment. But Stephanie's case fell apart when her own attorney realized that her client's story kept changing and that we had documented evidence of her public announcement, her attempts to manipulate mutual friends, and her admission that the entire scenario had been designed as emotional leverage rather than genuine relationship renegotiation. Even Stephanie's own sister called to apologize for not speaking up sooner about the obvious problems she'd observed over the years, admitting that the family had been waiting for me to finally stand up for myself and that they'd grown increasingly uncomfortable watching Stephanie's treatment of me during family gatherings. "We all saw how she talked to you," Jennifer said during our phone conversation, her voice heavy with regret and genuine concern. "The way she'd correct you in front of everyone, dismiss your opinions, make those little cutting comments that were supposed to be jokes but never felt funny. Mom and I talked about it constantly, but we didn't know how to say anything without making things worse for you." I attended the charity gala with Isabella, And our evening together revealed a natural chemistry and mutual respect that highlighted everything missing from my marriage in ways that were both illuminating and honestly quite healing after years of walking on eggshells around someone who seemed to find fault with everything I did or said. Isabella was the kind of woman who asked thoughtful questions about my work, listened to my answers without interrupting to insert her own experiences, and somehow made me feel like my thoughts and opinions actually mattered to someone other than myself. The silent auction featured some remarkable pieces from local artists, and Isabella's expertise in art curation made the evening genuinely educational and entertaining rather than just another social obligation where I'd spend the night managing someone else's mood and social performance. "You seem different than you did at the wine tasting," she observed as we examined a fascinating mixed media piece that incorporated vintage photography with contemporary sculptural elements. "More relaxed, more yourself. Less like you're constantly calculating how your words might be received or misinterpreted." Her observation was startlingly accurate. I had been unconsciously monitoring my own behavior for years, trying to anticipate Stephanie's reactions and adjust my natural responses to avoid triggering her criticism, corrections, or public embarrassment techniques. While Isabella made it clear she wasn't interested in being a rebound relationship or getting involved in the complicated aftermath of my marriage, we developed a genuine friendship based on honesty, shared interests, and mutual respect rather than manipulation, control, or the kind of transactional dynamic that had characterized my relationship with Stephanie. "I think you need time to rediscover who you are when you're not constantly defending yourself or trying to manage someone else's emotional volatility," she said with the kind of direct honesty that I'd forgotten could exist in relationships with women. "You're obviously a thoughtful, intelligent man, but you seem surprised when people treat you with basic respect and consideration." 6 months after the wine tasting incident, I ran into several people from that evening who mentioned they weren't surprised by the divorce outcome and that most of our social circle had been privately hoping I'd eventually recognize what everyone else could see clearly. Rebecca from the museum board actually thanked me for finally standing up to Stephanie's behavior, saying that watching her public humiliation of me had made everyone uncomfortable but that no one knew how to address it without creating additional drama or putting me in an even more difficult position with someone who was clearly skilled at emotional manipulation and social control. 1 year later, I attended another wine tasting at the same Worthington estate where everything began, but this time I was genuinely relaxed and enjoying meaningful conversations without the constant undercurrent of anxiety about managing someone else's mood, image, or social performance that had characterized my previous visits to social gatherings. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus and Diana had specifically invited me back to what had become an annual tradition, and several people mentioned how much more comfortable and confident I seemed compared to the tense, hypervigilant person they'd observed during my marriage. I could actually focus on the wine, engage in authentic conversations about art and travel, and express my opinions without mentally calculating whether my words would trigger criticism, public correction, or some form of social punishment designed to keep me in line and maintain someone else's sense of control over our relationship dynamic. Isabella was there with her new boyfriend, James, a fellow art curator who specialized in contemporary sculptures and had recently returned from a research sabbatical in Italy studying Renaissance restoration techniques. They all shared a friendly conversation with me that demonstrated the healthy boundaries and mutual respect I had learned to expect and demand in all my relationships, both romantic and platonic, after spending too many years accepting treatment that diminished my confidence and made me question my own perceptions of reality. "You look genuinely happy," Isabella observed as we discussed the evening's wine selection and the fascinating stories Marcus had shared about discovering small family vineyards during his recent trip to the Loire Valley. "There's something different about your energy now, like you're not carrying invisible weight on your shoulders anymore." When someone mentioned Stephanie's recent move to San Francisco for what they described as a fresh start and new career opportunities at a gallery that specialized in modern installations, I realized I felt nothing but genuine indifference toward my former wife's life choices and whatever narrative she was constructing about her reasons for leaving the city where she'd built her professional reputation. The absence of any emotional reaction, positive or negative, was perhaps the strongest indicator of how completely I'd moved beyond the toxic dynamic that had defined 7 years of my life and how successfully I'd rebuilt my sense of self-worth around healthier standards and expectations. I had learned to value partners who built me up rather than systematically tore me down, who supported my goals rather than undermining my confidence, and who treated our relationship as a genuine partnership rather than an opportunity for one person to maintain control over another through emotional manipulation, public humiliation, and carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to keep me grateful for any attention or affection I received. I had started dating someone new, Caroline, a financial planner who shared my appreciation for thoughtful planning, genuine conversation, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own worth without needing to constantly prove it at someone else's expense. She had her own successful practice, her own circle of friends, and her own interests that she pursued with the same methodical dedication I brought to my work, creating a relationship dynamic based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility rather than manipulation, control, or the exhausting emotional labor of constantly managing someone else's insecurities and need for validation. Reflecting on that pivotal evening at the wine tasting, I recognized that Stephanie's attempt to publicly humiliate me and establish dominance through her calculated announcement had actually liberated me from a relationship that was slowly eroding my confidence, self-respect, and ability to recognize healthy relationship dynamics when I encountered them. I wouldn't change a single detail of how events unfolded that Friday night, because they led me to discover my own worth, establish better standards for how I deserve to be treated, and ultimately find genuine happiness with someone who appreciated my character rather than seeing me as a resource to be exploited or a target for their own emotional manipulation. The wine tasting that had begun as Stephanie's attempt to control and humiliate me had become the catalyst for the best decision I'd ever made, choosing to value myself enough to walk away from someone who saw my dedication and loyalty as weaknesses to be exploited rather than qualities to be treasured and reciprocated in a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and authentic love.